All comments submitted before the end of the open comment period, whether given this evening or submitted in writing, will be reviewed and considered by the staff prior to the agency issuing its final determination on the air quality permit. DAQ staff will respond to all comments submitted and answer questions we are unable to address this evening in the response to comments section of the agency's final determination document. That document will be made available on the DEP website and sent to all those that have registered for this meeting this evening. If you did not register, I'm going to ask that you enter your name and email address in the meeting chat. And you can do that by clicking the little chat bubble icon at the bottom right of your screen and just enter your contact information there. The 30-day comment period for this proposed permit began on May 19th, 2023, and will end at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. Written comments can be submitted to the DEP at any time prior to that deadline. To ensure that we successfully achieve the purpose of this meeting, we ask that everyone be respectful and considerate of each other by refraining from using foul language, name calling, and interrupting others while they are speaking. We also ask that you keep your comments on the topic of this draft air quality permit so that our time together is used efficiently. One other note I would like to request is that if you aren't speaking, please keep your camera off if possible, so that way we can focus on those that are giving their comments or asking questions. We'll begin the meeting with a presentation from Permit Engineer Joe Kessler on the draft air quality permit and relevant information for the proposed CMC facility. We will then open the floor for a question and answer segment before moving on to official comments. Again, any questions that we cannot answer during the Q&A portion will be addressed in the response to comments document. When we move on to the official comments, each commenter will be given 5 minutes to speak, and if time allows, we can circle back to allow for additional comments. And I think it's important to note that once we start taking official comments, we will no longer be able to answer questions at that time. Any questions that you ask as part of your official comment will be addressed in the response to comments document. And again, just to reiterate, the written comments can be submitted to the agency at any point until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. Thank you for bearing with me through those opening remarks and instructions. I will now turn it over to DAQ Permit Engineer Joe Kessler. Joe?
Apologize for that. Let me restart that. As mentioned, my name is Joe Kessler, and I am the reviewing engineer on CMC Steel's proposed steel mill to be located near Martinsburg in Berkeley County, West Virginia. So what I'd like to do this evening is to give a presentation that not only goes through the specific project and gives you some details, but also gives you information on the permitting process itself, kind of puts it in context of the larger national air quality strategy. As mentioned, my name is Joe Kessler, and I am the reviewing engineer on CMC Steel's proposed steel mill to be located near Martinsburg in Berkeley County, West Virginia. So what I'd like to do this evening is to give a presentation that not only goes through the specific project and gives you some details, but also gives you information on the permitting process itself, kind of puts it in context of the larger national air quality strategy. And then we'll go through some details on the project. And then additional information on the documents that the DAQ has produced as part of this review process. Then we'll go over a little bit about what happens next and give you some summary and contact information. So to start off, I want to first talk about the permitting process within the context of the National Air Quality Strategy. And I think this is important so that we don't see this permitting process standing alone and trying to do everything, because that's not what it's designed to do. It's just one small part of a much larger regime, much larger strategy that's designed to protect the public health and welfare with respect to air quality. So if you look at the slide, you can see that this strategy starts with the Clean Air Act, which was an act of Congress, which gave the EPA a mandate to protect the public health and welfare. And one of the many ways they do that is they use science-based standards that we call the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, that are set, and we'll go into more detail on the NAAQS in a minute, but which are set to protect the public health and welfare. And they're based on science. They're based on studies, which in turn look at the effects of various pollutants that are specified in the Clean Air Act and their potential impacts on both humans and on the environment, on even plants and animals. So that's a really important step in this process, is those science-based standards. So once those standards have been set, there has to be a way of implementing those. And the way that's done is through a web of state and federal rulemaking that is designed to enforce and show compliance with those acts. And as part of that very large web of rules and regulations that, again, are both based at the state level and the federal level, are permitting requirements. And even within the permitting requirements, there are various different programs, one of which is a new source permitting program, of which we are in the process of dealing with today in this permitting action that subject of this meeting. So again, we have this web of rules which include permitting process, different permitting programs, one of which specifically targets new sources, so that these new sources can show through this process that they're meeting those national ambient air quality standards, as well as having a number of other goals within the permitting process, but one of the most important ones is to show compliance with those NAAQS. But even that's really not the end of this strategy, because beyond the permit, you still need to have an enforcement mechanism, which is also included in these rules are inspectors and enforcement sections to go out, physically visit these sites and make sure that they're in compliance with the permits that are designed to show compliance with the rules and regulations and back up the chain. So this just really gives you an idea of where that permitting process sits within this strategy, and shows that it's not designed to do it all by itself. It's not designed to go back and look at those standards, those NAAQS. That's already been determined. And it's not designed within it to function as a complete enforcement mechanism, because that then is passed on to the enforcement section. So it's just important to see that the permitting process is just one link in this chain that's designed to protect that public health and welfare. Before we move on to more specific information about the permitting process itself, let's take a moment to get into more detail about the national ambient air quality standards because they have such an important role in that national strategy that we just talked about. So the NAAQS, as we refer to them, are those science-based standards that are designed. Actually, there are two standards, and so they're designed for two different things. They're broken down between the primary and secondary standards. The primary standards are designed to protect public health. That's pretty self-explanatory, but it does include protecting the health of sensitive populations, such as asthmatics, children, the elderly, everywhere the public has access to. These standards are designed to provide that protection. These standards are not classified into subsections based on different populations. Importantly, too, there are secondary standards that provide public welfare protection. And this includes protection against decreased visibility, damage to animals or crops, vegetation, and even buildings. And a proposed source is going to have to meet both of these standards. Demonstrate that it will not cause a violation of these standards to receive a permit. So it's very important that these standards, again, based on science, are designed for both of these roles. Now, the standards themselves are set for specific pollutants that were part of the Clean Air Act. They were set for carbon monoxide or CO, lead, nitrogen dioxide or NOx, as we just referred to, ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. What the standards were not set for, and there are no standards for, are hazardous air pollutants. They do not have national standards. Instead, they are regulated under different programs that are targeted at specific HAPs, but more commonly targeted at specific facilities and facility types. So some pollutants have these national ambient air quality standards, some do not. Some don't have any standards of which we can compare potential pollutant impacts, and we have to use other means, other federal regulations to target those particular pollutants. Importantly, when it comes to the NAAQS, counties are usually designated by EPA as the area that is either meeting or not meeting these standards. And when a county, in this case, Berkeley County, meets the standards, we call it as in attainment with the NAAQS. If it doesn't, it's referred to as non-attainment. And whether a county is in attainment or non-attainment has a large impact on what rules and regulations a source has to go through to receive a permit. Berkeley County is classified as in attainment. All of those pollutants above for the NAAQS. So that's very important as we go forward, in that Berkeley County specifically has been determined as currently meeting those national ambient air quality standards. So now let's talk a little bit about potential permitting programs that are applicable to a new source in West Virginia and pretty much any state. So first, we can break it down into two major types of permits: a pre-construction permit and a post-construction operating permit program. What we're talking about today and where we are at in the process is the pre-construction permit. So we're not going to talk much about this post-construction operating permit program. That would only come into play after a source starts operating. So within the pre-construction permitting programs, there are three potentially applicable programs to a new project. There's the minor source program, the major source program within an area of attainment, and a major source program within an area of non-attainment. So the proposed CMC bill is defined as a major source of emissions. So that eliminates the minor source program. And as we talked about in the previous slide, Berkeley County is designated as an area of attainment with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Therefore, the program that we have applied, that does apply to the proposed CMC project, is Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD program, that is administered under our state rule 45 CSR 14. So that is the program that applies, and that has very specific requirements that we're going to talk about as we go forward, as opposed to the minor source program or the even more strict major source program in the non-attainment area. So CMC applicable to the PSD permitting program as applied for in West Virginia. So the next obvious question is, what is this PSD permitting program? What is its goal, and what does it do? Well, the goal of the PSD permitting program is to protect those current levels of air quality that are meeting the NAAQS, while allowing, though, for some industrial growth that may cause some impacts or deterioration of that ambient air within that county or that otherwise defined region. And that deterioration, though, can't exceed a certain level, which is defined as an increment, which is the significant part of the prevention of significant deterioration. So the counties in attainment with the NAAQS that are protecting public health and welfare, the goal of this program is to allow industrial growth. Some additional impacts may occur from this new growth, but the goal of this program is to limit those impacts to not to exceed that significant level, which is defined as an increment, while also always preventing, as a backstop, ever an exceedance of the NAAQS. So it's a complicated goal and a complicated rule, but that's what it's designed to do. It also has some other goals, one of which is to protect sensitive ecological areas, such as wilderness areas and national parks, that are defined by Congress and defined or designated as Class 1 areas. So that's an ancillary goal as well. So how does it do this? What does this PSD permitting process do as implemented under the state rule 45 CSR 14? Well, as you see on the slide, it's designed to determine and enforce compliance with the state and federal air quality rules and regulations that we talked about in the previous slide. All those web of rules and regulations, those that apply. This process looks at the applicability of those to the potential source and makes sure that the source will be in compliance. It also determines and inventories what the air emissions will be from the source and designs permitting language and requirements to enforce those, to make sure that those emissions will not be exceeded. It provides a framework of public notification and participation, of which we are participating today. It also requires, specific to 45 CSR 14 PSD process, the application of what is called the best available control technology. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail as well coming up. And very importantly, it requires air dispersion modeling, which is a very complex computer modeling use of a very complex computer modeling software to determine the impacts of the potential emissions from source. That is sort of the main mechanism to show compliance with the increment consumption that we talked about above, as well as making sure the NACs are protected. And then also it does require an additional impact analysis that looks at potential impacts on soils, visibility. So that's how it accomplishes the goal that's listed above. I think it's also important to quickly talk about what the PSD permitting program does not do. One of the important things and one of the distinctions between the PSD permitting program and the permitting program for major sources in non-attainment areas is that the PSD permitting program does not require the application of the lowest achievable emission rate, or LAIR. The application of LAIR does not take into consideration environmental or energy or economic impacts that are part of the backed application process. So that's an important distinction. And also very important, the PSD permitting program does not require a full environmental impact statement. So we don't consider the impacts of other environmental issues such as water or waste. PSD permitting program just gives us authority to focus on the specific air quality impacts that are part of the statute. And similar to that, the program does not take into consideration all the other important but non-air quality benefits or impacts, such as jobs, property values, zoning issues, the economics of the project, infrastructure, archaeology, all these other issues that surround the large projects such as this. We don't have the authority under the PSD permitting program to look at those issues and factor those in. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about several of these components of the PSD review. First of which is backed, or the best available control technology component within the PSD review. Basically, backed is an emission limitation that is in turn based on an emission control technology or pollution prevention methodology or mitigation strategy. That this limitation is determined through a very strict process that we call the top-down process, that in essence tries to determine what is the best demonstrated and available control technology or mitigation strategy for a particular emission unit that is achievable in practice, and then based on that technology or strategy, an emission limitation appropriate for that particular emission source is chosen. It is a somewhat complicated, involved process, but for a mature technology, a mature industry like steel, it is relatively straightforward. The key components, though, are that the technology selected must be technically feasible. It doesn't require a whole redesign of the source. It wouldn't change the very characteristics of what the source does. It takes into account other metrics, and it also, part of the review is looking at what recent back determinations have been made on similar type sources. And all of that goes into this sort of strict top-down selection process, and what comes out of it is this limitation that we call backed. The next part of the PSD permitting process that I want to go into in a little more detail is requirement for air dispersion modeling, just because this really is the foundation of a lot of what that rule is trying to do. So again, what this entails is the use of very complex computer modeling software that's EPA approved to determine the air impacts of this proposed facility, in this case the CMC steel mill, on the environment. So what it does is it uses steel met data, uses actual ambient air monitoring data, it uses real world elevation data, land use data, all these data points, even the proposed size and shapes of the buildings, to model impacts, the pollutant impacts on a per pollutant basis from a source. So they run these very complex models that can take many days to run. And then the output of this model is used to compare very set procedures from EPA to compare to the NACs to make sure that the impacts of a proposed facility will not cause or contribute to a violation of the NACs. The output of this model is also used to make sure that whatever deterioration, if you recall, the D and PSD of the ambient air quality, this deterioration is within acceptable limits. So you can't just push all the way up to the NACs limit. There are smaller increments, as they're called, that you're only allowed to impact. So that's what this modeling accomplishes, and it's very difficult, it's very complex. The results of which, though, are summarized in our fact sheet. So now let's move on quickly to the CMC project overview. There's a lot more information about the project in the fact sheet and the permit application, but as a quick overview, what they are applying for is a micro steel mill that is going to make long form steel shapes and products such as rebar. That would be what is probably going to be the most common product from the facility. A micro steel mill is just a classification of a steel mill that's smaller than a mini mill, which is typically smaller than a full-size steel mill that we may think of with blast furnaces, such as, say, wheeling pit. And how they accomplish making this steel, such as any steel mill would, is they take scrap metal, they melt it in the furnace. Now, what makes this steel mill, like a mini mill, more efficient, better than those older fashioned blast furnaces that use coal and coke to melt the steel, is this project would use an electric arc furnace, or EAF, to melt the steel. It basically just uses extremely high current through the scrap metal to melt it, rather than combustion of coal and coke. So this plant will have a maximum capacity of 650,000 tons per year of cast steel. And beyond the furnace, it will include a casting area where the molten steel actually gets shaped into the products, a rolling mill where the steel is rolled out into the final shape, again, most commonly rebar. And then an operation, if desired, to spool the rebar and a finishing and transportation area to ship out the product. That's about all this facility entails. It doesn't include a pickling area or degassing operations or some of the other ancillary operations that a mini steel mill might entail. It does include 70 million BTU of propane or natural gas fired combustion for various heaters that are used in the process and for comfort heat at the facility. There is also material handling for the scrap and the slag that's produced during the process. So that material has to be moved, brought into the furnace, the scrap, and the slag has to be taken out of the melt shop and removed from the site. There's also some small diesel storage tanks, cooling tower cooling towers are part of the process, and there are some emergency generators. It's a relatively compact, simple process because unlike other steel mills or mini mills, again, there's not a lot of extra operation or activities going on. And the only real feedstock of iron is the scrap metal. They're not bringing in additional sources of iron. So relatively compact, simple process. The controls on the process to limit the emissions are primarily, the main control is the bag house that controls the particulate matter off the furnace. So that's the primary emission source, and that bag house is the primary control device for that emission source. But there's also material handling, and so there's enclosures to keep dust from getting off the property and off of these material handling sources. Water suppression is also used where applicable to mitigate the particulate matter emissions. All those combustion devices I talked about use low NOx burners. There's also a requirement for good combustion practices, well-tuned combustion. The heaters have to be well-tuned so that the CO, VOC emissions are kept low. The SO2 emissions are going to be low at the facility, primarily because propane and natural gas are low sulfur fuels. So that's not a real issue at this facility. And then the greenhouse gases controls are plant-wide and unit-specific heat loss, energy efficiency requirements. So the facility is well controlled. It's controlled through the use of the back that we talked a little bit about. So again, very kind of a smaller footprint steel mill in the micro steel mill that's producing rebar. To continue a little bit with the project overview, I want to quickly talk about the compliance demonstrations for the facility. Importantly, the facility will include continuous emissions monitoring systems for real-time monitoring of the CO and NOx emissions from the EAF stack. So that again is by far the most significant emission source at the facility, and this will give us a real-time way of monitoring the CO and NOx from that stack. There's also visible emissions monitoring, requirements to monitor and record different material usages and steel production. There's requirements from federal regulations to have a scrap management plan so that you're only using quality scrap. Performance testing on again the EAF stack that we're most concerned about. They have to monitor the performance of the bag house to make sure it's operating correctly. Emergency generators are truly limited to only 100 hours of non-emergency use a year. So that very much limits their potential emissions. And then there's just extensive record keeping and reporting of all these requirements. And as we talked about way back in the earlier slide, after a permit is issued, if this one is issued, then the periodic inspections from the compliance enforcement section will review all this information to make sure they're in compliance. Detailed information on all this is in preliminary determination fact sheet, application, and the documents we'll go over shortly. So quickly, here is a picture of the proposed location of the plant. There are more details in the fact sheet that detail the site inspection that I did do of the facility, the proposed site of the facility. The key thing to see on this picture is that the yellow outline, the larger yellow outline, is the facility fence line, whereas the smaller concentration yellow lines is actually the footprint of the manufacturing area, which sits on a relatively small footprint. For one of the reasons it's referred to as a micro mill. So this picture just puts it in the context of the actual area. It specifically sits on the old Potomac River Works DuPont Explosives Manufacturing Facility site, which I think ceased operations in 1994. There's been several smaller operations that have gone on since then, but it's been a while, I think, since anything's going on right at the footprint of where they are proposed. Having walked the ground, I can tell you that the site is pretty jumbled up with old buildings and overgrowth and so on. Those old days of manufacturing. There are still some bunkers there, so there will be some significant cleanup that will be necessary before they could start construction. Quickly, just to give you an idea of some of the rules that apply, I have these listed. We'll not go into details into these rules. All the discussions involving the rules and regulations and the compliance therewith is included in the preliminary determination fact sheet. So you get a much better idea there if you want to dive into the details of how this proposed source meets these rules. But I have highlighted the key rules. And again, there's the major source permitting rule, the PSD rule that we've talked about. And on the federal regulations, you'll see the two items listed in red there. Those are by far the most important federal regulations as they deal directly with these types of facilities, and there is a lot of requirements within these rules that detail operating practices, record keeping, there's emission standards. So those are really the substantive regulations that apply to this facility. So let's go over quickly how we got to this point with a summary of our review. CMC submitted their original application in January. They have revised the application twice. As we've talked about, it was submitted as a major source subject to PSD permitting requirements under our 45 CSR 14. CMC placed their legal advertisement on January 5th in the Martinsburg Journal, and we placed our required advertisement when we had completed our preliminary review on May 19th in the same paper. And at that point, we made available a draft permit and the preliminary determination fact sheet. That started the 30-day comment period, of which we are in at the moment. And real quickly, the key points of that preliminary determination, which is really our rationale document of why we think the application is, or why the permit is on track to be issued. So the key points are that we've come to the conclusion that the proposed facility is in compliance with all applicable rules and regulations, does not exceed that increment under PSD. Again, it doesn't allow deterioration beyond that allowed amount that is called the increment. It also does not cause or contribute to exceedance of the NACs, in that they have properly proposed the use of backed on the emission sources. So those are the key points within our preliminary determination. So the documents that we do make available when we go to public notice, I have mentioned them several times. The two main documents are the preliminary determination and the draft permit. Preliminary determination can also be called the fact sheet or the engineering evaluation. All those terms are interchangeable. But really, again, it is the rationale document. It lays out everything in our review, sort of our basis for making that preliminary determination. Lots of tables, lots of information, taking all the information in the permit application and distilling it down, putting it in the format that we use to, again, show that we're on track, we think, to issue the permit, but only in a preliminary sense. The draft permit also is made available, and talked a bit about what it is, but it includes all the operating restrictions, emission limitations, monitoring, record keeping, reporting. It provides the basis to enforce the potential to emit, upon which based our rationale document to start that process of issuing the permit. So what happens next? Well, the comment period is scheduled to conclude at 5 o'clock on June 21st. And prior to any final determination, we will evaluate and respond to all the timely comments that are submitted before that time that are relevant to air quality issues. So I think we talked a little bit a while ago about what PSD does not do. So again, we're not going to be responding to comments about jobs and economics and things that aren't relevant to air quality. We will then make a final determination pursuant to the requirements of the applicable rules, taking into consideration all the comments that we've received. And then that final determination will be made available in the same location, put it up online, where we put the preliminary determination fact sheet draft permit. So to quickly summarize where we're at, CMC is proposing to build a micro steel mill in Berkeley County. DAQ, we've made a preliminary determination that the proposed construction will meet all applicable state rules, federal air quality regulations. We've made available an engineering evaluation fact sheet and draft permit. They've been available since May 19th. We will continue to accept public comments until June 21st, 5 o'clock. We'll evaluate and respond to all those comments that are related to air quality and that are submitted in time. And then we will make a final determination on the permitting action and make all the documents in that final determination available. So here's my contact information. If you would like to ask questions or talk to me on the phone, there's my phone number. If you have any comments, formal comments you'd like to submit, you can send them in hard copy, but the best way is to send me those comments in an email at the address given. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate your presentation there. Next, we're going to open the floor for questions. I'm going to call out the names one by one of the folks that signed up and indicated they wish to ask a question. And after that, if there are folks that maybe didn't indicate that or changed their mind and like to ask a question, we'll call on folks and ask you to raise your hand. So first up, we have Tom Markland. Is there a Tom Markland with us? Okay. Well, we can circle back to Tom and we'll move on. Next, we have a Brian O'Reilly. Is there a Brian O'Reilly joining by phone, perhaps? Okay. We can circle back to those. Next, we have a Brent Walls. Is there a Brent Walls joining by phone? Okay. Next, we have an Angela Durkin. Looks like we have an Angela Durkin online. Could you unmute yourself? You having some issues there, maybe?
Yes, I'm sorry. My questions were answered in the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we have a Christine Weimer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking our questions. I represent Jefferson County Foundation. We understand that CMC's process will produce a significant amount of slag, which has the potential to produce large amounts of dust and emissions from other unhealthy materials. What is the WVDEP doing to ensure that the final permit requires emissions from on-site slag processing to be well controlled and not result in contaminated runoff?
Yeah, so slag is definitely a byproduct of all steel production. And so specifically, well, actually, generally in almost all steel mills, and specifically in the proposed CMC mill, the slag gets quenched out of the furnace once it cools enough that there's no longer a hazard of quenching it with large amounts of water while it's still extremely hot out of the furnace. It's quenched and basically soaked wet. So it's that inherent moisture then, once it's processed, that is the primary mitigating factor of any emissions off the slag. And specifically to this facility, there's no slag crushing that's involved. There is some screening. So the nature of slag, if you've taken a hike along these old lumber access roads and different roads that go through the forest, they used to put slag on them all the time. So it's very dense, not particularly friable material. So it's not what I would consider a high dust potential concern like you would have like with limestone, especially if you're crushing limestone or a coal prep plant that's very friable. That's kind of easily entrained within the air as a fugitive emission. Slag isn't necessarily like that based on its properties. So because it's heavily quenched and it has that inherent moisture content within the processing, it's not considered a particular high dust probability source. That being said, the permit has language in there that they must maintain that inherent moisture of the slag material, so that if it sits out for a long time, it doesn't dry out and then have a potential to create even a minor dust problem at that point. So the answer to that is that primarily it is that inherent moisture that will be the mitigating factor for the slag. And for a steel mill overall, the permit limits this, limits the slag throughput through that processing plant. It's not, again, on the when you think of the amount of slag that a traditional old-fashioned, that we would say, steel mill would produce, it doesn't come anywhere close to that. So so it's not a real high dust concern for me because of the inherent properties and the fact that it's quenched but all that being said, there is a requirement to maintain that moisture content on the slag, and that should mitigate any substantive dust problems off of that processing.
All right, thank you for that question. That is the last person on our sign-in sheet that indicated they wish to ask a question. Is there anyone else who maybe would like to ask a question now? I ask that you raise your hand, and we can circle back to folks that maybe weren't able to unmute. The little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. If you want to click that and raise your hand, we'll call on you to ask your question. Sure. Tommy Markland asks if a question can be asked in the chat. Sure, go ahead. If you want to type that out real quick, we can hang on for a second and I can read it out loud and we can have that answered for you. Okay, so Tommy Markland has asked, how does the DEP plan to address any potential air quality concerns or complaints from local residents once the steel mill becomes operational? Joe, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I sort of alluded to it in the presentation, but once the facility is up and operating, we have a complaint line, and I'm again part of the permitting section and not an enforcement inspector, but we have a complaint section. We have a regional office in the Eastern Panhandle that would respond to complaints, and obviously that the way that they communicate to that particular region office is, I think, can be found easily online. So, we have an extensive compliance enforcement section with regional offices that respond to complaints and would send somebody out to the site. And again, I'm not in the enforcement section, but they often go talk to the complainant and then go investigate whatever the complaint is. That might be, if it is a dust problem, go take a reading of the potential opacity issue or an odor issue, whatever it may be. So part of that, again, that national air quality strategy, that last link in the chain is an enforcement section. And yeah, that's certainly a part of the Division of Air Quality. And importantly, we even have a regional office in the Eastern Panhandle that would respond.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question at this time? Again, I ask that you just raise your hand. If you're joining by phone, I believe you can unmute by hitting *6 and go ahead with your question. Okay. Not seeing anyone with their hand raised.
Hi, this is Brian O'Reilly. I was trying to ask a question earlier. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. I am a homeowner located southeast of the proposed facility location. I'm curious as to whether there are any toxic or noxious materials that have been identified that would be emitted from this facility that are not strictly enforced under West Virginia or federal guidelines that you're aware of.
No, the toxics or the hazardous air pollutants that have been identified are all regulated pollutants as hazardous air pollutants. Now, as I talked about earlier, these pollutants don't have national standards like the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, like NOx and SO2 and the criteria pollutants, the more familiar pollutants. But this proposed mill is subject to federal regulations that specifically are designed to address the emission of hazardous air pollutants from this type of facility. So in that sense, they are identified and they are controlled, and they're primarily controlled out of the bag by the bag house that controls the particulates that come off the furnace. So in that sense, they are. There's nothing that's been identified as a substantive pollutant coming off of this facility that is not at least within that classification as a hazardous air pollutant that is in turn targeted in one of those federal regulations. In this case, called what we call the MAC rule, which is I think it's 5Y. But I won't go into too much detail on that. You can find information about that particular rule in the preliminary determination. So the answer, the somewhat nuanced answer, is that there's nothing that I know of that's been identified as a non-regulated toxic from the facility. It is regulated, although not a standard. Again, not a national ambient air quality standard. It is regulated under one of those other federal regulations I was referring to within the presentation.
And I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Because there was a question asked previously about the slag and the potential for dust emissions and so on and so forth that would result from those renderings, if you will. And I think, if I understood correctly, your answer was that the nature of that material is such that under normal circumstances, it doesn't result in what might otherwise be considered noxious or injurious or dangerous emissions. But will there be, I mean, notwithstanding your professional opinion with respect to this slag versus slag that was produced during other periods, will there be any measures in place to measure the output or the result of whatever dust or emissions that might result from that?
So the emission of the slag itself, again, let's back up and we'll kind of take this in two parts. Notwithstanding it for the moment, we'll put aside what the slag is. So I guess my first answer, in sort of alluding to the previous question, is I'm not concerned, it's not me, but personally, but I don't think there's necessarily needs to be a concern about high volume emissions of slag based on its composition, its sort of relatively non-friable nature, and this idea, not even idea is a bad term, but based on this fact that it's quenched and it's got this heavy moisture content even during its processing. So as far as the amount of slag that I actually think is going to blow off site from this process, I think is going to be relatively insignificant. Especially even the physical properties of the site, with especially toward the west, with that sort of a low ridge that kind of sits down in a bowl on the eastern edge of that little ridge. So the amount of slag that I actually think is going to blow off site, I think is going to be relatively minor. That's just not necessarily a concern for me. Again, so if this was a quarry, with high volume crushing of limestone, and you would think, somewhere that's out on a very flat area, you'd be more concerned, and you would have to possibly address that in that manner. So that's one side. So the one answer is I don't think much is going to get out of the site. Now, what actually the slag is that it's a composition of some of the impurities in the steel making process that's pulled out by various additives. And I don't, in previous, looking at this, I don't think slag dust is necessarily a toxic in and of itself. Slag has within it, even if it has specific, say, metals within the slag, it's, the slag itself has different properties than the components within. It's a bound matrix of, we've looked at this before, what slag is. So if there's a particular metal within the slag that's been removed from the steel, the slag dust does not have the same toxic properties as the components, sort of bound within the matrix of the slag. So all that being said, it's just not a particular concern for me. It's not a real high volume source. They're not, it's not making a lot of it. I don't think much slag is going to make it off the site, and slag dust itself, as dispersed, the little bit that might dispersed, that doesn't fall out, because again, slag is dense, and not even the friable parts that actually make it into the air are not necessarily, they're going to be prone to falling out quickly. So the dispersion of it, I don't feel is bad. And then it's not like something like asbestos, where you would be extremely concerned about any amount that's ultimately reaches a point of inhalation. So all that being said, I'm not sure if I've answered your question or just kind of given a thesis here.
No, you've actually been very helpful, and I really appreciate it. The challenge I'm having, and forgive me for probing further on this, but when you use phrases like, I don't think it's going to be, we'll travel very far. The question I guess I have is, what constitutes very far? So, for example, this proposed facility is located adjacent to the Potomac River. So, is it likely that slag or other, effluent or other potentially toxic or noxious materials will travel far enough so that they would then be dispersed over and into the water? I understand, and again, forgive me for treading into areas that are not within the dominion of this hearing, but are there possibilities that airflow or that waste will carry out into the river, which is certainly within a half a mile, if not much less, in terms of proximity to the river, into the river, with the effect that we have to be concerned about those overlapping impacts, if that makes sense?
Well, that's, rather than me just continue to speculate, we can talk on a quantified basis here as well. So, if you actually look at the emissions, the calculations and the amount of emissions of slag, it's that is calculated based on EPA approved emission factors and the throughputs, the actual numbers associated of particulate matter, because that's what we're talking about. Ultimately, any slag that's up in the air is emitted as particulate matter. The actual numbers are really, really small. So based on the the best emission factors we have, and the idea taking the properties, which includes that moisture content, you try to figure out, okay, let's quantify how much is actually emitted. Now, it doesn't say how far it travels, but the actual emission of it is very, very small. And so the quantifying, on that side of it, you can quantify, at least based on the paper. Now, and there's another whole way to look at this too, is this complex air dispersion modeling, all the results of which are attached to the fact sheet. You can really dial down and look at the modeling of the PM 2.5 and the PM 10 modeling, and you can kind of see the distribution of of what those impacts show. Now, the majority of those impacts, though, are pushed by not emissions of the slag, but the emissions from the EAF stack, which are not slag. But you can actually see where those have been looked at, the emissions of that particulate matter through the modeling. And even beyond that, then we can even go a level higher and go back up to the NACs, which again are designed, at least on a particulate matter basis without specifying the type of particulate matter, are designed to protect the public health and welfare, as we talked about, or as I talked about in the slide, which includes impacts to water, soil, vegetation, and so on. So again, I can speculate that I don't think, again, the density of the specific slag and the low emission rate, is it going to travel and fall into the Potomac River or into the watersheds? You know, I just don't think that that's necessarily going to be an issue at all. So on the speculation side, experience side, there's very little of it. It's dense. The fallout will probably mostly be right around the within the plant boundary. Any that gets out, I don't think will go necessarily that far. On the quantified side, we can look at actual numbers associated with slag emissions. We can look at the modeling. We can see that the particulate matter, when grouped all together with the other particulate matter sources, still meets the NAAQS, still doesn't exceed the increment. So those are the metrics that I have to look at when evaluating this. So those are really about as far as I think I can go on that question. And you know, from both the experience side and the numbers side and in the speculation side.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking my follow-up questions.
Thank you, sir. Do we have anyone else that would like to ask a question? Ask that you raise your hand. We can call on you. Okay, not seeing anyone with their hand raised. So it's going to be the last call for questions. Okay, since there are no other questions, we will now move on to the official comment portion. And as I stated earlier at the beginning of the meeting, now that we moved into the official comments section, we won't be able to answer any more questions this evening. Any questions that you ask as part of your official comments, we will address them in our response to comments document. Each commenter will be given 5 minutes to speak, and then we can circle back if you would like to make additional comments if there's time. So I'm going to call on those that indicated on the sign-in sheet that they wish to provide comments, and then we can open the floor for anyone who did not sign up that way. So the first commenter I have is Brian O'Reilly.
Hi, my questions have been answered. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next, we have a Robert Barrett. If you would like to give your comments, please unmute your line and begin with your comments. There. No comment. Okay.
Hi, this is Brian O'Reilly. I do have a follow-up question if you can still take it. I apologize.
Okay, yeah, since we haven't actually received an official comment, we can circle back for one more question.
Yes, can you possibly, I'm just sitting here reflecting on everything that's been said, and this discussion has been very helpful, so thank you very much. But I'm wondering, can you summarize, I don't think this was discussed earlier, can you summarize possibly the emissions monitoring program that would be required to be put in place going forward, not only at the facility, but perhaps even in surrounding areas? And will there be an opportunity while that monitoring is in place to make adjustments if some are needed? In other words, if it's determined that for whatever reason wind patterns change, circumstances change, and more monitoring in a particular direction is needed. Can you talk about that? Because I don't think I heard much discussed on that point.
So I'll take the first part of that. So when we talk about monitoring, there's really two separate types of monitoring that we talk about. We talk about source specific monitoring that involves monitoring a specific source for compliance with the emission limitations and operational restrictions, et cetera, that are imposed on that particular facility by a permit. And so that monitoring, again, you can read some stuff about it within the preliminary determination. You can see the monitoring section in the draft permit. And for this particular facility, there's direct stack monitoring of NOx and CO from the EAF stack. There's also parametric monitoring, which is just the monitoring of various parameters in the plant to limit the size and scope of the facility to what they applied for in the application. So there's monitoring of how much steel they're making, how much slag they're processing, how much scrap they're bringing in, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's monitoring of control devices to make sure that they're operating correctly, the baghouse in particular. So there's other things. So you've got all this source specific site monitoring that's making sure that the facility is operating the way it's supposed to and not exceeding the limitations that are in the draft permit. Now, that's one type of monitoring. Another type of monitoring is ambient air monitoring, which is not on site, which sits somewhere and just collects data about the particular pollutant concentrations within a region, a county, or wherever that monitor is located. And for West Virginia, we have a number of monitors throughout the state that are put where they're put, and based on the pollutants that are all determined in a plan that we send to EPA, and it's approved by EPA. And it has a modeling component as part of that determines where the worst case potential for some of these pollutants are. So that's where we can put monitors. We don't have monitors of every pollutant in every county. That would be beyond sort of any agency's capacity to do that. But we know that if a particular monitor's in a heavily industrialized area and it's and that monitor's showing compliance, then one in a rural county next door would be probably an inefficient use of resources. So I'm going to leave my discussion on monitoring at that, because that's not my specific area. But if anybody else here has anything to add, I don't know. That plan does get periodically reviewed. It gets reviewed annually.
So
and I think our plan is currently out to notice. So there's nothing.
So
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so thank you for that. I think there are references to the ambient monitoring plan in some of the documentation that I was able to identify or locate online. But it seemed to me that the ambient monitoring that's in place is more macro ambient monitoring as distinguished from sort of micro monitoring that might relate to this specific facility. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm correct, then it would seem to me that if you happen to be in a subdivision located proximate to this facility, or in a school proximate to this facility, or across the river in Maryland at a recreational area proximate to this facility, or 5 miles down the river or 10 miles down the river in Shepherdstown, for example, there's no planned ambient monitoring, at least as proposed currently, that would measure and monitor pollutant levels pre-construction versus post-operation. Am I correct?
You're definitely correct in your distinction between macro and micro. The idea though, and here's where the PSD rule though tries to identify that issue. So you're right. There, as you called it, it's a good classification. And we'll say the macro monitor that are out there to monitor the ambient air quality in a particular area, and it's not targeted to a specific facility. But if we think back to the presentation and what I was talking about, the computer modeling. So what it tries to do is it takes the potential emissions, the worst case emissions from this facility, and it runs them through, just like we talked about, this very complicated simulating computer software to simulate what are the worst impacts of the facility, and then it compares those to the NAC. So you again have those NACs and that increment out there as backstops to the actual impacts of the proposed facility. So the regime is, or the strategy is, that modeling is a more efficient way to determine what the impacts are of a facility, rather than trying to build and extend every time a new facility was built, to go out and it's very expensive and manpower inefficient to build a system of monitors for every specific facility. So within the Clean Air Act, within the PSD rule, the idea is that, well, instead, before it's ever built, we're going to try to figure out what these worst case impacts are before it's ever even constructed. And that was considered a better use of a more efficient use of resources to determine. So a lot is based on that modeling. Now, as a backstop, though, annually, the monitoring data is looked at. If one of these counties starts exceeding the NACs based on this monitoring data, then it falls into that non-attainment status, in which case it gets much harder to construct anything new. And in fact, if you do construct something new, a major source, you have to actually offset any new emissions by retiring old emissions. So it still has that monitoring, that macro monitoring still plays a role even after it's constructed.
Yes, and I appreciate that, and I certainly do not profess to be an expert in the area of the Clean Air Act. I am not, I can assure you. But I mean, now if I'm speaking colloquially or just candidly, the reality is that how many of these major facilities get built in a particular county, or more specifically in Berkeley County. So, right, I mean, who wants to be the guy downwind of one of these facilities once it's determined that, wow, you're over the standards? I mean, it seems to me that at some point the horse has left the barn, and now everyone downwind is suffers the adverse impacts or potential adverse impacts of that circumstance. So I guess my question really is this. I understand the point about efficiency and monitoring and how it's not efficient to, put monitoring measures in place in connection with every single proposed facility. I totally get that. But then again, as I think you acknowledge, that's a standard that is being applied at the macro level, at the national level, in the context of the Clean Air Act. We're talking now about a very specific micro circumstance that involves the petition or the application by CMC. So I guess my question would be, notwithstanding those considerations, is there an opportunity here prior to the approval process in the interest of bringing peace of mind and comfort to the residents of Berkeley County, folks who have lived here for years, who have made material investments in their homes, in the lives that they lead, who have children that go to schools that will be very proximate to this facility, people who have bought, built, and improved properties downwind from these facilities, folks in Maryland, who are, less than a mile away from this facility, are there opportunities in this specific case to put monitoring measures in place that, though they may be more expensive, would provide the peace of mind to those in this community, businesses and individuals, that the standards that are being committed to in this as part of this application are adhered to down the road?
Well, that would be beyond what the PSD rule requires. So, that would have to be a decision that would be made by the director. I don't think we've ever made a decision quite like that before. So, I mean, what I would just like to say again is that there is high confidence in that the modeling is an accurate worst case representation of what the impacts of the facility will be. I mean, they've been modeling these sources for at least 30 years. And
but I think I feel like they
have.
I do think we all agree that we're all trying to avoid worst case scenarios, right?
Well, no, the worst case is that they've modeled the worst case emissions from the facility. So you look at what's the maximum it's going to produce, and those are what's put into the model. And based on what those models, the impacts those models predict, compared to what the current monitoring data shows, for the county, you look at that and you basically try to add those together to make sure that the NACs, based on the existing monitoring plus the new impacts of the facility. And again, this all happens before, so the horse hasn't left the barn yet. The barn hasn't been built yet. So before any of that, it is relying on the monitoring to do it, because at this point there's no facility to even if you wanted and had the resources to put a specific ring of monitors around the site, it doesn't exist yet. So the modeling is a way to predict that worst case impact, to make sure that those NACs are protected. And like I said, then you still have the backstop of the ambient monitoring that does measure the impact, and it is in a macro sense. And I'm not sure any monitor could necessarily be in a true micro sense. If you put a ring of monitors around the facility, those are going to be impacted by vehicle emissions and other sources. So I think, the idea that you could somehow, even if you wanted to very, very specifically target exactly what is contributed to from a particular facility would be very difficult. Pretty much I'm going to have to leave it at that. That would be a good formal comment to submit. But again, as a permit engineer, I can just speak to the fact that there's no statutory basis for that, and the intent is that that computer modeling, that air dispersion modeling, is predicting those impacts before the facility is ever constructed.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your engaging on this topic.
Okay, thank you. One last call for questions before we move on to official comments. Okay. I had already called on Robert Barrett to provide his comments. He said he did not have any. The last person I have on my sign-in sheet is Christine Weimer.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I represent Jefferson County Foundation, and thank you for taking our comments this evening. It is not clear that the permit requires CMC to report air emissions information in a way that will allow the public to verify that the plant is complying with the terms of its permit. Please improve the monitoring and verification of actual air emissions in the permit. Please require continuous emissions monitoring systems for emissions such as mercury, greenhouse gases, oxides of nitrogen, manganese, and chromium. We understand that CMC's process will produce large amounts of slag, which has the potential to produce large amounts of dust and emissions of other unhealthy material. Please require that CMC more completely define what is occurring with the slag and any on-site processing of the slag, including crushing, screening, or pile activity. Please ensure that the final permit requires emissions from on-site slag processing to be well controlled and prevent any contaminated water from wetting of such processes from running off.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anyone else that signed up to provide a comment, so I'm going to open the floor now for anyone who may have changed their mind or didn't register that would like to provide an official comment. If so, please raise your hand. We'll call on you. Okay, anyone joining by phone that would like to unmute their line and go ahead with their official comments? Okay, not seeing anyone, so going once, going twice. Okay. If there are no more comments, this will conclude the virtual public meeting on the draft air quality permit for CMC Steel, West Virginia's proposed steel micro mill in Berkeley County, West Virginia. To properly receive your agency response, we ask that you make sure your email address, and contact information was included either in the online registration form or is available in the meeting chat. As I mentioned earlier, written comments can be submitted at any point until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023, and you can send those in either by regular mail or email to Joe Kessler at the DEP, and his information was included in the slideshow there. So again, we want to thank everyone for your interest and for taking the time to attend this meeting. Have a good evening.